The Galactic Military Academy was a fortress of discipline, war, and tradition, a place where only the strongest, fastest, and deadliest warriors were forged. Inside its massive training hall, built to withstand the force of superhuman strength and devastating alien abilities, young cadets from across the galaxy honed their skills in preparation for interstellar combat. And standing among them, looking like a fragile insect among titans, was Jane Miller, the first and only human ever admitted into the program. She looked absurd in comparison to the other cadets. While they towered over her, clad in advanced environment suits designed for their unique physiologies, Jane stood there in a simple blue training uniform, utterly unimpressive. Around her, warriors from dozens of species gathered, some with exoskeletons harder than steel, others with multiple arms, and a few who floated above the ground, using alien abilities to manipulate gravity itself. She had been here for 3 months, and in those 3 months, Jane had become a joke. Everywhere she walked, she heard the whispered snickers, the amused glances, the casual dismissals. She's still here? Probably won't last another month. Why would they let a human in? She can barely lift her own weight. Jane ignored them. She had to. Commander Stone, the Academy's brutal, crystalline-bodied instructor, strode across the hall, his 6'7" frame shimmering under the artificial lights. His voice, sharp and metallic, echoed through the cavernous space. Group 4. Advance to the obstacle course. Jane's heart pounded. Her group. She took her place at the starting line, standing between 2 of her more imposing classmates. To her right was Thorn, a 7-foot-tall juggernaut of a warrior with obsidian black armored skin, a natural-born predator whose people had conquered entire planets through sheer brute force. To her left was Pulse, a sleek, almost ethereal cadet whose body crackled with bioelectric energy, his species capable of short bursts of lightning-speed movement and discharges powerful enough to fry a human nervous system. 2 monsters. And then her. A low chuckle rippled through the cadets behind her. She won't even make it past the first wall. Jane ignored them and focused on the course ahead. The starting challenge was a gravity-enhanced wall climb, a 40-foot vertical structure, its surface shifting and reforming constantly, making each climb unpredictable. Commander Stone's voice rang out. Begin. Thorn leaped onto the wall with the ease of a spider, his clawed hands digging into the structure effortlessly. Pulse didn't even climb. He phased up the wall in a blur of speed, electricity sparking off his limbs as he landed gracefully at the top in seconds. Jane jumped, barely managing to grip the first handhold. Immediately, she felt the weight of the enhanced gravity pressing down on her arms. She gritted her teeth. Pull. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she hoisted herself up, reaching for the next handhold, then the next. Her movements were slow, painfully slow. The other cadets had already cleared the wall and were moving through the tunnel crawl ahead, a twisting labyrinth of shifting metal. Jane was still climbing. Someone snickered from the ground below. Pathetic. Her fingers slipped, and she nearly lost her grip, her body dangling for a terrifying moment. Her mind screamed at her to let go, to quit, to stop humiliating herself. But then she thought of Earth, her home. She thought of the centuries of human struggle, of all the times humanity had been underestimated, outmatched, outgunned, written off as weak, only to adapt, endure, and win. She wasn't here to prove them wrong. She was here to prove herself right. Jane gritted her teeth, locked her fingers onto the next hold, and climbed. By the time she reached the top, her muscles were burning. her vision swimming with exhaustion. And the rest of her group was already finishing the course. She jumped down, landing on unsteady legs, and pushed into the tunnel crawl, her one advantage. Jane was small, unlike the other cadets. Where their massive frames struggled through the tight spaces, Jane slipped through easily. She clawed her way forward, ignoring the sharp edges scraping against her arms. But it wasn't enough. By the time she emerged, covered in bruises and sweat, the rest of her group had already crossed the finish line. She was 2 minutes behind the acceptable standard. 2 minutes too slow. Commander Stone's crystalline face was unreadable as he marked her failure on his datapad. "Miller," his voice rang out, "you are falling behind." Jane forced herself not to react. "Sir, yes, sir." Stone turned to the rest of the class. "The Galactic Defense Force requires peak performance. Natural combatability is essential for survival in modern warfare." He didn't need to say it. Everyone already knew. Jane didn't have natural combatability. That night, Jane sat alone in her tiny quarters, staring at her academy acceptance letter glowing on her datapad. The words that had once filled her with pride and excitement now felt like mockery. She had passed the entrance exams. She had been accepted. And yet, she wasn't good enough. Not physically. Not according to their standards. She rewound the day's footage, watching herself fail again and again, watching herself struggle where others excelled. Her body wasn't built for this. Her species wasn't built for this. But as she analyzed the footage, something clicked in her mind. Jane began noticing patterns, the way the other cadets fought, the way they relied on their natural abilities. They didn't think before they acted. They didn't need to. Their strength was their instinct. Her strength would be her mind. Jane paused the video, her eyes narrowing at the screen. Maybe she had been going about this all wrong. Maybe she wasn't supposed to fight like them. Maybe she was supposed to fight like a human. Her hands moved with new determination as she opened a new file on her datapad, pulling up ancient Earth martial arts techniques. Boxing, Krav Maga, Judo, Wing Chun, fighting styles built for survival. Techniques designed not for the strongest, but for the smartest. A small smile tugged at her lips as an idea began to form. She wasn't going to match them. She was going to outthink them. For the first time since arriving at the academy, Jane felt hope. She turned off her datapad, stood up, and headed for the empty training hall. It was time to start fighting like a human. The academy was silent at night. The massive training halls, usually filled with the sounds of sparring, combat drills, and the stomping of alien warriors, were now dimly lit and empty. Except for Jane Miller. She stood in the simulation chamber, her fists clenched, her muscles aching from the day's brutal failures. But tonight wasn't about following their rules. Tonight was about something different, adapting. She tapped a few commands into the control panel, her only friend in the academy watching from the shadows. Blitz, the maintenance android, whirred to life, its blue optical sensors flickering as it observed her. "Cadet Miller, your presence in unauthorized training facilities is irregular." Jane smirked. "Yeah, well, I'm full of irregularities." She tapped the console again. A holographic enemy materialized in front of her, a towering armored warrior from Thorn species. Jane took a deep breath. In the past, she had tried to fight like them, and failed. She had tried to mimic their forms, their techniques, and failed, because humans weren't built for that. But Earth had survived thousands of years of war, of conflict. Humans had fought and won against opponents bigger, faster, and stronger since the dawn of time. And now Jane was going to prove that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't its muscles. It was its mind. The holographic warrior charged. It moved in perfect academy form, executing the 7th combat pattern, a flawless sequence of strikes and counters that the academy had spent centuries perfecting. Jane didn't block. She didn't match its strength. Instead, she moved. As the warrior's massive fist came down, Jane sidestepped at the last possible second. The hologram's own momentum carried it forward, throwing it off balance for a split second. That was the weakness. Jane struck, not with brute force, but with precision. A quick jab to the exposed gap between its armor plating. The warrior stumbled. Blitz's sensors flickered. Fascinating. You are not engaging directly. Jane grinned. Nope. I'm fighting like a human. The hologram recovered and attacked again. Jane flowed like water, dodging, weaving, and using its own size and power against it. Every species in the academy fought the same way. They relied on their biological advantages. But humans? Humans had spent millennia fighting without any. When the enemies were stronger, humans used speed. When the enemies were faster, humans used deception. When the enemies were bigger, humans used their own weight against them. It wasn't about being stronger. It was about being smarter. Jane ducked under a blow, slid behind the hologram, and delivered a perfectly timed kick to the back of its knee, the weak joint. The warrior crashed to the floor. Simulation paused. Jane exhaled, sweat dripping down her brow, as Blitz analyzed the data. You have increased your combat efficiency by 47% in a single night. Your method is unorthodox. Jane wiped her face. Good. Let's make it more unorthodox. She pulled up new simulations. More enemies. More species. She wasn't just training to fight them. She was training to outthink them. And she had a lot of work to do. The next day, Jane stood in the training hall, arms crossed, watching the other cadets practice the same combat forms over and over again. They didn't think. They followed patterns. And that's why she was going to beat them. Commander Stone, his crystalline body gleaming, called for sparring matches. Jane felt eyes on her. The cadets laughed when she stepped onto the mat. Again. Maybe if we let her start with a 5-minute head start, she'll last 10 seconds. She ignored them. Her opponent? Rex, the Academy's top warrior. A 4-armed colossus with razor-sharp claws and a combat record of 0 losses. He grinned, stepping onto the mat. I'll make this quick, human. Jane smirked. No, you won't. Commander Stone's voice boomed. Begin. Rex charged. He attacked in perfect academy form, a rapid, precise strike sequence that should have ended Jane in seconds. Except Jane wasn't there. She had already moved. The crowd gasped as Rex's claws hit nothing but air. Jane was behind him before he could react. She struck, not with brute force, but with surgical precision. A sharp jab to the nerve cluster between his scales. Rex stumbled. The cadets went silent. Jane wasn't winning with strength. She was winning with something they didn't even understand yet. The training hall was silent. Hundreds of cadets, massive, powerful warriors from across the galaxy, watched with stunned disbelief as Rex stumbled. The Academy's top-ranked fighter, the undefeated champion, the one who was supposed to crush her in seconds. And yet, here he was. His 4 muscular arms twitched. His body refused to respond. Jane stood calmly in front of him, her chest rising and falling steadily, a fresh bruise forming on her arm where one of his wild swings had grazed her. She had just done the impossible. Commander Stone's crystalline form flickered slightly as he processed what had happened. This wasn't how fights were supposed to go. Miller. His voice cut through the silence. Explain what you just did. Jane rolled her shoulder, shaking out the tension. I exploited an anatomical weak point between his nerve clusters, she said simply. Temporarily disrupted motor function. He'll recover in 15 seconds. Stone's crystalline face was unreadable, but Jane knew she had shaken him. She turned back to Rex, who was furious. His nerves started reconnecting. His fingers twitched, his fists clenched. His pride had just taken the biggest hit of his life. You got lucky, he growled, rolling his massive shoulders. I wasn't ready. Jane raised an eyebrow. Want to try again? Rex bared his fangs. The challenge was accepted. Commander Stone hesitated, but then nodded. Begin. Rex charged, and Jane was ready. They fought like monsters. She fought like a human. Rex attacked with raw, overwhelming strength. His forearms moved in a synchronized, deadly pattern, the same combat forms that had been drilled into every warrior in this academy. And Jane? Jane didn't fight like them. She didn't stand her ground. She didn't block. She didn't counter with force. Instead, she flowed. Every time Rex lunged, she was already gone. Every time he swung, his claws slashed through empty air. Every time he tried to grab her, she had already moved. To the outside world, it looked like chaos. But to Jane, it was precision. She wasn't dodging randomly. She wasn't just running. She was forcing him to move the way she wanted. Rex's strikes were getting sloppier. He was getting frustrated. And Jane smiled. She could see exactly how this was going to end. The final move. The cadets were on their feet. No one had ever lasted this long against Rex. They had never seen a fight like this. The academy taught strength. The academy taught power. But Jane was showing them something else. She was showing them how humans survived. Rex growled in frustration and made one final mistake. He overcommitted. He lunged with all four arms, putting everything into one final, crushing blow. And Jane? Jane let him. She stepped in close, inside his guard, where his own strength became useless. And then a sharp jab to his throat, a strike to the inside of his elbow, a final push against his own momentum. And suddenly, Rex was falling. The cadets gasped as the mighty warrior hit the mat, hard, flat on his back, defeated by the weakest cadet in the academy, by a human. Silence, then chaos. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then the entire hall exploded into chaos. What just happened? She cheated, she had to. No one beats Rex. Rex stared up at the ceiling. He was breathing hard. His fingers twitched, his jaw clenched, and then he laughed. The sound was deep, guttural but genuine. He let out a slow breath and sat up. You? He looked at Jane with something new in his eyes. Not hatred, not mockery, respect. You really are different. Jane wiped a trickle of sweat from her brow. Took you long enough to notice. The academy would never be the same again. Commander Stone stepped forward. His voice was unreadable. Miller, report to my office after class. Jane held his gaze. This was it, the moment she had waited for. She had forced them to acknowledge her. Not as a joke, not as a weakling, as a warrior. As the cadets erupted into arguments, debating what they had just witnessed, Jane stood tall, because she knew the truth. This wasn't the end of her fight. This was only the beginning. Jane stood in front of Commander Stone's desk. His crystalline form gleamed under the artificial lights, his sharp features unreadable as he studied the combat footage on the massive display behind him. The replay showed Jane moving like liquid, flowing through Rex's attacks, using his own strength against him, and finally, taking him down. It was undeniable. She had won. And yet the moment felt heavy. like she was standing at the edge of something big. Stone slowly turned, his glowing eyes locking onto hers. "Sit," Jane obeyed, keeping her expression neutral even as her heart pounded in her chest. The commander had never called a cadet into his office for a simple discussion. He only did so when careers were about to be made or destroyed. The judgment Commander Stone was silent for several moments. Then his voice came, calm, deliberate, piercing. "You have disregarded centuries of proven combat doctrine." Jane didn't blink. "You refuse to execute the standard combat forms." She sat taller. "You have openly defied the structure and traditions of this academy." A pause, and then a slow nod. "And yet, you won." Jane felt her breath catch in her chest. She had expected punishment, expected rejection. But this? Commander Stone clasped his hands behind his back. "The purpose of this academy is to train warriors to win battles, to survive wars, to be the greatest force in the galaxy." His glowing eyes narrowed. "And you, Cadet Miller, have demonstrated something we did not account for." Jane hesitated. "Sir?" Stone turned back to the screen, where the footage played again. "You fight like no one else here. You think differently. You move differently." He turned his gaze back to her. "You fight like a human." Jane's fingers clenched against her knees. This was it. The moment that changed everything. Stone's voice was calm, but absolute. "We will no longer dismiss human combat techniques." In fact, his crystalline fingers tapped his console and new data flashed across the screen. "Effective immediately, we will begin implementing a human-based combat division." Jane's breath hitched. "Wait. What?" Her mind reeled. They weren't just acknowledging her, they were adopting her methods. This entire institution, built over centuries by warriors far stronger, faster, and deadlier than her. They were about to learn from her. Stone folded his hands behind his back. "You will oversee this initiative." Jane blinked. "Sir?" Commander Stone's glowing eyes locked onto hers. "You have shown us that raw strength is not the only path to victory." His voice carried a weight she had never heard before. "We can either dismiss your methods and fall behind, or adapt and evolve." He tapped a final command into his console. Her name flashed across the screen. Her new title, Instructor Miller, Advanced Human Combat Adaptation Division. The first human to ever teach at the academy. Jane felt a slow smile form on her lips. She had fought to survive. She had fought to prove herself. And now, she had changed the entire game. The fight that started a revolution. The news spread like wildfire. For centuries, the Galactic Academy had been the gold standard of combat training. Every species learned the same techniques, fought with the same strategies, and followed the same rules. But now cadets from every species were lining up to learn from Jane Miller, to study human combat, to fight like her. The first lesson. The training hall was packed. Jane stood at the front, arms crossed, surveying the gathered cadets. Thorn, Pulse, even Rex. They'd all come, some out of curiosity, some out of resentment, some out of genuine respect. Rex stood at the front, arms crossed. "This better be good, human." Jane smirked. "Oh, don't worry," she said, stepping onto the mat. "I'm about to change the way you fight forever." The human who changed the galaxy. Years from now, warriors across the stars would tell stories about the human cadet who rewrote the rules. They would say she had been a joke, that she had struggled, that she had been weak, but they would also say she had done something no one else had. She had forced them to evolve. She had made them fight smarter. She had shown them that the deadliest weapon in the galaxy wasn't claws or strength or speed. It was adaptability. And in the end, that's why humans always win.